Welcome back to Gimme Some Truth. Today we're going to dive into the wonderful world of Epic stock. And what I think makes this so interesting a topic is that it's near and dear to our heart. We have a bunch of clients from Epic. We actually have people that worked at Epic here sitting in these very chairs. So we will talk about that in a second. I'm Clint Walkner. This is Alicia Vande Ven and Mitch DeWitt, and we're talking about Epic stock. So as an intro here, Mitch, you've worked with a variety of different Epic clients over time, and Alicia, you've actually used to work at Epic. So a little bit about your experience there.
Yeah, so I worked at Epic right out of college, as people tend to do. And I wasn't there long enough to participate in the stock program that they have now. But my ex-husband is celebrating 20 years at Epic this summer. So when he got his first grant in 2017, we had no idea what it was or what to do with it. And that was before I got into this career. And I actually spent a ton of time figuring out what is an 83B election and what is restricted stock and what does this all mean. And little did I know that eventually I would use that to help my career. But at the time, I was just trying to figure out what it meant for our family and how we were supposed to handle it, and have learned a lot since then.
What was your favorite building in Epic to go to?
I really like the medieval one. Like when I go to a museum, I'm a sucker for like the medieval armor and stuff. And so the building that looks like a castle with the drawbridge and the medieval stuff is one of my favorites.
And your role at Epic was what? I know we talked earlier about how, saying you're a financial advisor at a party often makes people scatter, and saying that you're in this department also does as well.
Yeah, saying I was in HR at Epic I would usually say I'm in human resources or I work at Epic, and I would rarely lead with both because people would ask me a lot of questions like, why didn't you hire me? But yes, that was not what I wanted to do ultimately, and am much happier in this profession now.
Well, so if you're watching this, congratulations for getting hired at Epic, because you're probably watching this now. Very challenging to get in. So what makes Epic stock specifically so challenging to kind of break down?
Yeah, well, so when I started at Walkner Condon, I had all this experience about how Epic stock worked, but I didn't necessarily have a lot of knowledge of other type of stock plans. And that's where Mitch came in. Mitch had worked with a lot of other clients with a variety of employer stock plans. So kind of his expertise with equity compensation in general, combined with my expertise on Epic specific stock, was really helpful. And I learned that it was set up very differently than any other company sets up their plan, and then they kept changing it. So what they did in 2017 was different than what they did in 2019 and then 2020, and then there were bonus shares and there was vesting and 10-year shares, and they changed the vesting schedules, and it was really hard to kind of get a handle on it because they would change the structure of the grant every year.
So Mitch, when you guys kind of work on organizing a plan for everyone, how do you guys break that all down in the types of stock they have and everything?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the first things is understanding what you have. And because sometimes it's common, whether it's someone at Epic or I'll pick another Madison company here, but Exact Sciences, right? Understanding what they have, because people will come in and say, oh, I have company stock. Okay, that's great. That's probably a true statement, but how did you acquire that stock? What flavor of stock is it? And those are all important questions to understand, just whether it's vesting or the tax ramifications if and when you ultimately sell the stock. So really understanding what you have. So for Epic, many years ago, SARs, or stock appreciation rights, was something that was a little more common. Not the case really anymore. There's still a few people that I think have some SARs floating out there. But now it's just more of the stock that they've purchased, or in some cases they've actually been given some free shares. So it kind of depends, to Alicia's point, of what year was it, what role were you in. There's a lot of different factors, but really starting with what is it that you actually own, and then how can we develop a plan from there.
Lots of spreadsheets, right?
Oh, yeah. So many spreadsheets. And I have like templates because, I don't reinvent the wheel each time, but then because everybody has done it differently, they also give you the opportunity to convert your SARs. So instead of just cashing in your SARs, you could convert those to stock. Some people did that, some people didn't. They also let you refinance some of the loans that you took out to buy the stock. They also let you take out loans to pay the taxes, which is unheard of anywhere else. And some people refinance those and some people didn't. So everybody has a different timeline for when their loans are due. Everybody has different vesting schedules for all their different grants. Some people still have SARs that they didn't convert that are expiring either this year or next year. So yeah, it's a lot of different stuff, and just kind of putting that all together in a way that makes sense is step one.
With that, I mean, just my brain goes off thinking about how many people have handled it properly on their taxes. You being in tax services, specifically for Walkner Condon, what have you seen? What's your experience there? Are people doing that right?
I think it all gets kind of on their W-2 as from like when they vest in the stock, it just gets reported. And so there's not really anything you have to do when you vest. I think a lot of people aren't aware, though, of the fact that when you vest, that's when you're taxed. People think that they're not taxed until they sell it, but they're taxed when it vests. And so they will have all of this income, but they won't actually be receiving that as income. They're just getting taxed on it. So that's been a big surprise for people. And then understanding, well, what is the tax liability? If I'm investing on this much in Epic stock, what is that going to do to my tax bill? And am I taking out a large enough loan to pay those taxes? Or am I going to get surprised with a huge tax bill? And I've definitely had quite a few clients who are like, I owed $20,000 and I don't want that to happen again. How do I avoid that in the future? So just anticipating what that's going to look like and making sure not only that you know what's coming, but there's a lot of things that you can do to reduce that or to plan for it, and to make it hurt a little bit less.
One thing we could also talk about a little bit, and you mentioned it already, but the 83B election.
Yes.
And fun fact, when we were interviewing Alicia 3 years ago, whenever that was, part of her interview process was writing a blog on the 83B election, which is a very specific task and something that she nailed, obviously, because we hired her.
I was gonna say, I got hired, so
she must have done great on the blog. I remember the blog, certainly. But could you hit on the 83B election? Because that's another tax complexity, but also a very opportunistic planning tool.
Yeah, so this was really important during the first few years that they were awarding stock, because it allowed you to basically pay taxes now at the current share price instead of waiting and paying taxes when it vests. And that's a really good thing to do if you have the money to do that, you think the stock price is likely going to go up, and you plan on staying at the company long enough to actually vest in those shares. But it basically means prepaying the taxes, but the idea is that you're doing it at a lower rate. And I won't get into the weeds here. You can read my blog post or ask me about it, and I will be happy to get into the weeds with you on it. But it is a really complicated thing, and not many people did it because it's really hard to understand. But for the people who did and then stayed at Epic, it's pretty powerful.
And you have a short turnaround time. You have 30 days to make that election. So it's one of those things, I think, in a lot of people's cases, even if they knew that this was an option to prepay the tax, the 30 days might feel like it's a little rushed and like, okay, that's a big decision and there's out-of-pocket costs, and then they would just let it go. But you're right, there's risk in that too, because you could prepay a tax on stock that maybe you don't even invest in.
Yeah.
Thankfully, Epic stock has primarily gone up. Of course, it could go down, right? But it has continued to grow.
Yeah.
So that's the other big thing. If you think that thing is going to continue to grow, that's where it's going to be a potentially valuable tool.
Yeah, and talking about what you have and understanding what you have is obviously very important, but then the next step of that is, once you know what you have, really starting to define your goals and what this is going to be long term, because for many of these people, this is a massive chunk of their retirement.
Oh, yeah.
And they have to make good decisions, and you could unknowingly put yourself in a bad financial situation if you're not planning your exit. It's kind of like with our business, when people say you should always do, your own exit planning now. And I'm like, well, I'm like 48 years old. I don't need to do exit planning now, except for you actually have to do it, because if you're actually going to seed control or you're going to, monetize these investments, you got to plan that out, because it's not just 1 year you're going to take it unless you want to get destroyed in taxes, right?
And that's the thing is, and I mean, you guys see this because we see this with non-Epic people, but people will come in and they're like, I'm looking to hire an advisor. I just retired. And you're like, okay, that's great. And we can help you. But if you would have started 5, 10, 15 years ago, there's so many more things that you can do. There's so many more levers you can pull if you start planning years before, right? And so if somebody comes to me and they're like, hey, I'm leaving Epic this year, what do I do? We can help you, but if we would have started planning for that 5 years ago, there's so many more things that you can do to help sort of mitigate the tax burden, kind of plan for that income, and really just make sure you're taking advantage of all the different opportunities that you have by kind of planning ahead. So I think that's the thing, is people wait until they're having to sell the stock or until they're retiring to start asking those questions. And the right time is now. I know 2024 was the last year that the 2017 grant vested, and for a lot of people, that was huge. And so we get people asking, well, I'm starting to see how much this stock has grown to. Because at first, it didn't really feel like real money. Mm-hmm. Like when we first got the grant in 2017, we didn't know what it was going to be worth. He wasn't vested in it yet. So we're just kind of like, I don't know what this is, but okay. And now it's starting to feel real. Now people are vested. We've seen the Epic stock price grow year after year. And people are realizing that they have to start treating this like real money. Mm-hmm. And planning for it accordingly. So, and that can be really exciting. Maybe things you thought you couldn't afford to do, like helping your kids pay for college, retiring sooner than you thought, maybe helping your parents if they're old and need help, taking more family vacations, whatever your goals are, understanding how to use this to help you achieve the things that you want to achieve.
And I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but Mitch, do you have an example of maybe an investment strategy that you could employ now that could have benefits for people leaving later?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. The first one that comes to mind is something like direct indexing, right? And that is something, maybe in the show notes, we can post the direct indexing blog that Clint wrote, because we send that to clients all the time. It's a great piece, and we've got lots of good feedback on that. In any event, to go away from plugging our blog, direct indexing is actually a really powerful tool, because in summary, it's kind of a way where you unbundle, think of an S&P 500 fund, whether it's an ETF mutual fund. Instead of just owning that one fund, you unbundle it, and you own 400 of the 500 stocks, let's say, in the S&P. Why would you do that? You do that to get tax losses, essentially. Tax losses are good. They can pile up and actually carry forward, where if you get enough losses piled up, and sometimes it takes years, you can accumulate a number of these losses while still getting market gains. That's the other key thing to know. We're not losing money just to lose money. No, you're actually getting tax losses while still performing like the market. And then those can carry forward and actually offset future liability, whether it's selling or redeeming Epic stock or some other big event, right? It's a strategy that not just Epic people use, but we use it for clients for many different reasons that have a future big tax liability, I'll say.
Yeah, there's some charitable giving opportunities there as well inside of that Epic stock, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can do a donor advised fund in the year that you plan on redeeming a bunch of stock. You can fund a donor advised fund that year, so that you itemize your deductions, reduce that tax burden, and then you can use that fund to then continue to give to charities over the next few years. So it's kind of like grouping all of your charitable deductions into 1 year so that you can take the tax deduction for it, and that can be really powerful for people who are charitably inclined and who want to give to charity anyway. And this is a way that can really help your taxes while also being philanthropic. So that's a good option for people to do kind of in that year that they redeem the stock, and then kind of continue to give out for multiple years. And then you pair those things, right? You do direct indexing, you do something like a donor advised fund. When you start to group all those things together, in addition to just tax planning in general, and this is where the understanding what you have is important, because different shares are vesting in different years. There's actually one grant that all of the free shares vest in 1 year. So knowing kind of when your income on paper is going to go back down. Now maybe you're in a different tax bracket, or maybe your spouse works and they're going to stop working or retire early. Understanding how you can kind of take advantage of kind of the natural peaks and valleys of your family's income, or when you have to pay back some of those loans, and just planning that out over multiple years so that you're not just kicking that tax bill down the road.
You made an interesting comment on like your family, right? Because when you're doing holistic planning and tax planning, you obviously have to take the if you have a spouse, right, then you have to take that in consideration, right? Because sure, there might be one spouse. Actually, we have some people where both spouses work at Epic, but it's important to know what's going on in the other side of the equation as well. From an income perspective, do they have stocks that are going to be vesting, you know, for wherever their employer? So there's a lot that actually goes into this holistic and forward-looking tax planning. It's not just the person at Epic. We actually sometimes need to take a step back and see like what else is going on holistically.
And tax management is so important, but also another component of it that we hear a lot of, and there's a few misnomers, and I wanted to touch on those too. Kind of the risk management part of it as well. People are taking these loans, sometimes rather large loans, and they worry about the loans. And so we've seen a few people employ some strategies that might not be, I'll call them strategies, I'm being nice about it in quotes, but do some certain things that might actually not benefit them because they're risk managing in a way that actually isn't as informed as it probably should be.
People who are debt averse, right? They don't want to take on debt in order to buy the stock. They see that as a risky move. So then they instead are using their own money to then pay for the interest or pay for the taxes or pay for the stock itself. And what they're actually doing is instead of putting that risk onto Epic, they're actually taking that risk on themselves. And I think the important thing that maybe, you know, Epic doesn't do a good enough job of communicating this is that the loans that you take on to buy Epic stock are non-recourse loans. So if Epic loses the ability to pay out the stock, if Epic goes bankrupt or can't pay what they say the stock is worth, or if the stock is worthless, you are not on the hook for those loans. So if you can't use the Epic stock to pay off the loans, you're not on the hook to pay those loans. And that's what we talk about when we say risk management, is you're transferring that risk to Epic as opposed to taking that risk on yourself. And I know it's kind of counterintuitive to that idea of like paying down debt. And so sometimes it's just, it requires a little bit of mental gymnastics, I guess, to, you know, you have to think of it in a different way and look at it as you're actually reducing your own personal risk by taking on more of the debt.
Very different than maxing out your HELOC and dumping it into a publicly traded stock, for example.
Yeah, do not recommend.
Very, very different.
Yeah.
Even though I think conceptually some people are like, oh, well, you're kind of like taking a loan, but that's the difference between non-recourse, which you described, right? Like,
yeah.
Don't do the HELOC thing I just mentioned for the record.
Because if you do that and the stock you buy goes to zero, you still have to pay back that HELOC.
Yes, you do, at 8% or so.
Yeah, and a bad interest rate where, you know, I think Epic gives you the lowest rate that they can give you. So they're really trying to make it easy for people. I think people are like, what's the catch? And I'm like, the catch is you have to work really hard.
The catch is they want
right?
you to
like
stay
they want you to
long-term.
stay, obviously. Yeah. And like Epic is not an easy place to work. It is challenging. They hire people who are driven, who are smart, and they expect you to work hard. And like the catch is you stay and you work hard. Mm-hmm. But they are trying to reward the people who have put in the time and who've put in the hours, who work there. And yeah, just...
I mean, there's some contractual encumbrances there too, which you can understand. They're protecting themselves. They want tenure. They do that by tying some of the stock compensation to some of those. And you know, I think that's reasonable, you know, as far as...
They extend the non-compete.
Yeah,
exactly. And that's the thing that people, you know, sometimes get upset about is that you are extending your non-compete by taking the Epic stock. So that's, I think, something to think about if you're kind of thinking about, well, when am I going to leave Epic? That's definitely a consideration. But the other thing that, you know, people wonder is how does their exit plan of leaving Epic tie into their Epic stock? When do I stop taking future grants? How do I pay back my loans? Do I wait to redeem it all until I retire or until I leave? So those are the questions that a lot of people are starting to ask, even if they don't have a plan to leave Epic tomorrow. They still want to understand, well, what does it look like if I leave next year or if I leave 5 years from now?
Yeah, I think that if I was going to make an appointment, first of all, I would just strongly encourage you to make an appointment with Mitch and Alicia, because I think they're the experts on this out of all of our teams here at Walkner Condon. But second, what can they do to get organized and get ready to meet with you guys?
Great question. Epic has done a much better job recently of providing ways for people to see all of their stock kind of in one place. The problem with there being multiple ways is some are better than others. And the summary that I always want to see is the one where it's not super pretty, but it does say by grant how many shares you have, what the share price was, how many are vested, unvested, how many you redeemed. And it just kind of goes down and says this grant, here's what it is. This grant, here's what it is. So that's an important one. And then the stock loan summary, understanding what are your loans, when are they due, and what are the interest rates? Because that is also different for everybody, depending on if they refinanced or not. So those are the two biggest pieces of information from like the Epic perspective, but then a lot of it will also come into your personal situation of like, do you have investments outside of Epic? Does your spouse work? What are your future plans? Do you want to retire at 50, or do you see yourself continuing to work longer than that? So there's a lot of other pieces that come in, not just from the Epic stuff, but from people's own personal situation. So having an idea, I think, of what your goals are. Sometimes we ask people like, well, when do you want to retire? Or what do you want to use this money for? And they don't know. And that's okay. But I think it's definitely something to start thinking about is, if I told you you could retire tomorrow, would you? And then what would you do?
A lot of young potential retirees. I know that from our clients that we have from Epic, the money has become real now, and they've reached a point where they're entering that financial freedom phase of their life. They're working there because they enjoy working there. And
work optional, as we always say around here.
Exactly. So we're getting there. And I think it's time, if you've been there a while and you haven't talked to anybody, really need to sit down with somebody and just construct that. Because once we reach that financial freedom and that work optional lifestyle point, I think it's a lot more freeing for people because they feel like they don't have to work. They're choosing to work. And then, like you said, Alicia, it gives you that thought of, what am I going to do? Is there a second act to my career, or am I done? Am I going through kind of the fire stuff and I'm out and I'm going to retire as soon as I can, or am I going to cascade into retirement doing the things that I want to do? It could be there, staying there forever. It could be, working part-time. It could be, I had a client that's pivoting and going into teaching, and it's awesome. Like, they've kind of reached that end point and they're going out and they're going to teach. So I think there are wonderful examples of post-career stuff or work optional stuff that we can help them with and solve into. So I would say at this point, hopefully you have a greater understanding of, know what you own, keep that spreadsheet that they have over there at Epic, and we can help with the spreadsheeting of all the other assets. Grab your fidelity statement with your 401k, the outside assets as well will help goal plan and make you understand what you have, and start to get together a game plan on your exit and how we plan that out. Are your investments now structured in a way that we can take advantage of, a multiple year divestiture of those shares? Or if it's all at once, how can we plan for that as well through the use of, donor advised funds and direct indexing and things like that? And we'll just go through some strategies with you and make sure that you feel comfortable, and hopefully you decide to continue to work with us in that journey. So, again, if you have any comments, you want to just expand on anything that we did, leave in the comments section, send a direct message over to Mitch and Alicia. We'll be happy to get a response back to you. And thank you for joining us on this episode of Gimme Some Truth.
Walkner Condon Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walkner Condon Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit WalknerCondon.com.